Hello quilters, welcome back to our sampler quilt. Today we're going to make block number 2. The name of the block is Pinwheel Polka and it's designed by Marilyn Foreman, and I'm going to hold this closer so that you can get her information, and you might want to go to her website and see what she's all about. First thing I need to share with you are our cutting instructions. And you may not be able to see this right now, but I'm going to show it later, and you'll be able to copy everything on here so that you'll know what to cut. If you look at this block, it really is a pretty block, and you can see the pinwheel in the middle. The block is put together with the flip and stitch method, which we're going through and I'll demonstrate. I also want you to notice that the pinwheel in the middle has a kaleidoscope effect. And I'd like to share with you how we're going to create a kaleidoscope effect in our quilt. So first, though, I need to tell you what parts or what pieces you need to cut. You need to cut 4 rectangles that are 3.5 by 6.5. And I want you to do that by cutting a strip of fabric, the width of the fabric, that is 3.5 inches wide. Once you have that strip, you really should cut 4 strips that are 3.5 inches wide. Once you have done that, stack the strips, and then you can cut the 4 rectangles that you need out of that piece of fabric, and you will have the middle of the pinwheel that goes in the middle of the block. The next thing I want you to see is the solid black fabric behind the pinwheel. For that, you need to cut 4 rectangles that are also 3.5 by 6.5. So once again, cut the 4 strips from your fabric across the width of the fabric, stack the strips, and then you can cut your rectangles. From those strips, you're also going to cut 4 squares that are 3.5 by 3.5. And those rectangles and squares, you're cutting from the fabric that will be where the black fabric is. The next thing you see is the red solid. For the red solid, you must cut 4 squares that are 5 by 5. So once again, you can cut a 5-inch strip across the width of the fabric, and then cut your squares from that strip. And the last thing that needs to be cut are the little pieces that you see here in the corner. Here it's in a black, a black polka dot. That might not be your choice, but from that last piece of fabric, you need to cut 4 squares that are 3.5 by 3.5. And once again, cut a strip of fabric, the width of the fabric that is 3.5 inches wide, and then you'll be able to cut your squares. And so just to recap, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 fabrics in this block. Your fabrics don't necessarily have to be black, red, and black polka dot and black print, but they're going to be whatever you want them to be. Just remember that you have to cut the parts you need to cut. If it helps you to remember more easily, when we cut these rectangles, those are considered part A. When we cut from the next fabric, we cut 4 rectangles that are 3.5 by 6. They're also considered A. 3.5 by 6.5, I'm sorry. They're also considered A. Then when we cut 4 rectangles that are 3.5 by 3.5, or 4 squares, that's B. That's our B section. When we cut our 5 by 5 squares, that's our C. And when we cut the 4 squares for the corner, that's D. And so you can pretty much keep up with constructing the block simply by putting the letters on the parts that we're cutting. And before I cut my first rectangles that I need, I want to share with you how we can cut those and create a kaleidoscope effect. Here is the piece of fabric from which I'm going to cut them. I have 4 pieces of fabric stacked together, and they all are stacked directly on top of each other, so that this design right here is what I'm featuring. And I put them together in such a way that this design is stacked on top of itself 4 times. Now, let's see if I can show you a little bit. I don't want to disturb them too much. They're still pinned, but here you can see, here's fabric 1, and then there's fabric 2, fabric 3, and 4 is under there somewhere, unless I picked 2 up without noticing it. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is measure 6.5 by 3.5. And so then I can cut these in, so that you see that little shape in the middle that looks like a fan? That's what I'm after. I want that in the middle of my block, just like this floral fabric is in the middle of this block. It's the pinwheel. I want those fans in the middle of the block in a giving a kaleidoscopic effect. So here we go. All right, now I have finished cutting, and I have my pieces cut the way I want, featuring the design that you see, and that design is going to be on, it is on all 4 of the fabrics. So once again, the first cut you're going to make will be out of your first fabric, and on our sheet, it's the floral fabric in the middle that makes the pinwheel. And that's what these fabrics are going to do that I'm holding in my hand. That's fabric A, so I can put that down there. And then we have fabric B, which is, in my case, it's the light blue grunge that I have. And fabric B is also where you see the black, the solid black, behind the floral fabric, and that is fabric B. Then my third cut was fabric C, a 3.5 inch by 3.5 inch square. And that's also shown in black here on the picture that you see. So fabric B was this black here, and fabric C is also this black, which is why I cut these rectangles that are 6.5 by 3.5, and these squares that are 3.5 by 3.5 from the same fabric, because I want them to be the background on which my pinwheel will lie. So we've got A, B, and C, And then we're told to cut squares. We have to get these 5-inch squares. Here you see it in red, and I know it doesn't look like a square on the picture, but because we're using the flip and stitch method, it will eventually look just like the trapezoid that you see here on the picture in red. So here are my squares, the 5 by 5 squares. And the last piece of fabric we are supposed to cut are the pieces of fabric that will go in the corner. On the picture, it's a black and white dot. I'm using this particular fabric for the corners of my block. So now I have all of my fabrics cut, and I will begin to put my block together. We start putting the block together by taking one of our fabric B and attaching it to fabric A, right sides together. And I want you to see exactly where I'm placing it. You see that? I'm placing it so that it's in my right hand. That's going to be important. If you're looking at it down on the table, it's on the left end of A. So I'm going to put all of them together, standing right here so that you can see. This is fabric A, and I have fabric B, and I want to lay it down on A exactly like that. If it's laying down, B is to my left. And that's very important that you follow that position in each of these. So fabric A again. Here is fabric B, right sides together. And I'm going to put fabric B on that end of A. And here is the last one. So that all of them are assembled exactly the same way. And I need you to notice this because orientation is very important for constructing this block. Now, we're going to stitch this. Remember, we're doing the flip and stitch. We're going to stitch this from that outside corner to the inside corner. And I'm going to mark that for you so that you can see it. I've got my little ruler out so that I can make sure I have a straight line. I want you to pay close attention to where I am marking this. It's the outside lower edge corner to the inside corner. We're going to stitch this on a diagonal, and once I've drawn this line, you will be able to see that more easily. Look at the line. Outside lower corner to the inside upper corner. That's where we're going to stitch each of these. So I'm going to mark each so that you can see me doing that. If you're comfortable stitching that line without drawing a line, that's fine. I kind of like a little line there or the indication of a line. So I'm going to mark all 4 of these so that when I get to the sewing machine, I'll know exactly where I'm going to sew and I won't make any mistakes. I'm kind of old and my mind sometimes wanders, and I might get to the sewing machine thinking about 100 other things that I have going on and might start to stitch it incorrectly. So nobody likes taking seams apart. I definitely don't. And I don't want to bother with having to take this seam apart because it's creating a bias. All right, now they're all 4 marked, and I've put a little pin in there to hold them together so that I can take them to the sewing machine and get them stitched. And then I will show you what they look like when I have completed that. Here they are. They're all stitched. And now we go to the next part. Remember I told you we're going to use the flip and stitch method for this block. So that will entail taking what is sewn, flipping it over itself until we get this. So in the meantime, we don't need all of the fabric that's left on the back side of the seam. So my next step is going to be to trim that extra fabric out of the way so that I don't have a lot of bulk. And I'm just using a little ruler because it's just easier to manage right now. And when I cut this, when I trim this, I want to trim it down to 1/4 of an inch. So I'm using the 1/4 of an inch seam allowance right here, a measurement right here to create the seam allowance. You don't want to trim it all the way up to the stitching. That's a no-no. Don't do that. Treat it the way you should with having a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance left. This is what I mean. Trim it so that you have 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And now let me get the rest of these trimmed, and then we press them. I don't press until I have trimmed everything, just to make sure. Because you know, if you get creases in your work that the iron has placed there, they are almost impossible to get out. So I'm putting the 1/4 of an inch mark on the seam allowance, and then I can trim right beside the edge of the ruler, knowing that I have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. If you make a lot of these blocks, you're going to have quite a few of these little triangles left over. I did when I made a whole quilt with this block. Sorry about the phone ringing. I get a lot of robocalls, and that's what that was just then. But I have finished trimming all 4 of my pieces of fabric, and now I'm going to press. And I was telling you about getting these little triangles. You will have quite a few of them if you make a quilt using just this block, as I did. And so I started sewing them together, and I think I can make a really good lap-size quilt out of what was left. So you might want to hold on to these. Don't throw them away, and you might be able to use them in another project. Okay, I'm going to the ironing board and press these. Here they are pressed. And now, remember, the fabric is labeled so that we pretty much know what to put on next. I have attached A to B, so it stands to reason now that I'm going to attach a C. And I'm building the background behind the pinwheel. So I'm going to the sewing machine and get that done, and then share that with you. Here we are. These have been sewn and pressed, and I tend to press the seam allowance toward the last piece of fabric that I have added. So in this case, I press the seam allowance toward B, and this time I've pressed the seam allowance toward C. And all 4 of them are done the same way. Now we're ready to move on to the next step, which is another example of the flip and stitch method. The next thing we need to add is our 5-inch squares. In my case, they're white. On this diagram, they are red. So this is what we're going to put on next. And you can see that there will be some trimming since I'm starting out with squares. But what you see are, well, they're not really rectangles, they're trapezoids. And forgive me with the language. I taught math in middle school for many, 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 many years. So I like for people to call shapes what they are. Some of my quilting students here give me a hard time about that sometimes, but If it's a trapezoid, call it a trapezoid. Don't call it a rectangle, because it really is not a rectangle. And I'm just putting my squares on top, and I'm going to show you exactly where they need to be placed. As you look at the unit that has been created so far, we're really working on one side. To get all of these pieces on, we're going to be working on this side. So we put the 5-inch square right here. As I'm holding it up, it's in my right hand. But if I have it down on the table looking at me, it's on the left. Just like the first square was on the left, this square is also on the left. And once again, we're going to stitch it from outside corner up to inside corner. So I'm going to mark that line for you. Won't be in red this time because this fabric is so light and that red would show through. But I'll put a thin pencil line on it so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. And just keep in mind that you're using the same angle that you used previously for the first triangle that you sewed on. So I want to go from outside corner to inside top corner. And I really want to get to the corners. Put a little pin in that so you can see it. And that is the direction in which you are going to stitch, from that outside lower corner to the inside upper corner. And that's how we will do all of them. So I'll get them stitched and then show them to you. Okay, they're all stitched. Here's the one on which I drew the line, and you can see the stitching. It might be easier to see it on one on which I don't have a line. The thread pretty much matches that beige grunge so well that it might be a little bit difficult to see. And they are all sewn exactly the same way as I mentioned before. We start at the lower outside corner and we sew up to the upper inside corner. Now remember, we're also using flip and stitch. So this is going to flip up like that, which means I have to trim this inside triangle off. And that's why I mentioned to you before that you might want to save these, because you may very well be able to use them in a future project. So here we go. I'm going to trim like before. And I'm going to put my ruler down in such a way that I have 1/4 of an inch seam line, 1/4 of an inch seam allowance out here after I trim. So the ruler is placed with the 1/4 of an inch measurement on the seam line, and then I'm ready to trim. Place the ruler with the 1/4 of an inch measurement on the seam line, and make sure it's nice and straight, and that you also want to make sure your stitching is nice and straight, and then you get to trim that triangle off. When I first made this block, I just almost collapsed because I thought, I'm wasting all this fabric. But the resulting block is so pretty that you just immediately think of ways to use what you've trimmed off, and you don't get too upset about it. And I can hardly wait to show you this kaleidoscopic effect. In fact, when I made the quilt some time ago, I made it using an African fabric for the pinwheel, and I was able to move around on that fabric so that for 30 blocks, I got 30 different kaleidoscope pinwheels. And I just think it's the prettiest thing. Okay, so they've been trimmed and now they need to be pressed. Now they're all pressed. And I know that we don't tend to press toward the light, but I've just got this thing about pressing toward the last piece that I added. So you can see them a little bit, see the seam allowance a little bit, but that's okay with me. Now, the last thing we're going to attach to our unit before we sew the units together is that last little corner. And you've probably guessed it by now. You're going to place that corner right here. See, the process doesn't change as you're adding new pieces. The process remains the same. So we put the corner on, and you could probably tell me we're going to stitch from that outside corner to the upper inside corner. Okay, once again, our stitching will be from this outside corner down here to the inside upper corner there. And that's what we're going to do on each one. I can lay it down, and maybe you need me to draw a line again, which is all right. That's nice and dark, so I can use this, use an orange pencil on it so that you can see it. But this is our way of stitching it this time, just like before. That's the one thing about this block. The process does not change from piece to piece to piece that you're adding on. The process is the same. This line is kind of faint, but prayerfully you can see it. And can you see the little line there going from this outside corner to that corner? And that's what we did to add this on. That's what we did to add the 5-inch square on. And it's the same thing we're doing now. So I'll get this stitched and I'll get back to you. Now that they've been stitched, and I'm sure you can tell me what has to be done next. We're going to trim this outside part off using the ruler by placing the 1/4 of an inch mark on the seam allowance and trimming so that we do leave a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. You don't ever want to trim right up close to the seam line. That's an invitation for the seam to come loose and get your frustration going, which none of us likes to have happen. So instead of allowing that to happen, make sure you trim, leaving a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, And that's so easy to do using the 1/4 of an inch measurement on your ruler. Okay, now they need to be pressed, and you'll get to see the 4 units that will be sewn together to make the block. Here are our 4 units, and now I'm going to arrange them the way they will go in to make the block. Let's get things aside so you can see this. Pay attention to what happens in the middle, since we have a kaleidoscopic effect in the middle. Oh, I love it already. Can you see that design forming in the middle? Isn't that fabulous? Oh my goodness. Uh-oh, something isn't right. Oh, there it goes. Got panicky there for a minute. Look at that. Oh my goodness, isn't that beautiful? I don't quite know what I'm going to get, but then I end up getting something I could never have imagined or never suspected. Look at what's happening. Now, you don't have to fussy cut your pinwheel to get a kaleidoscopic effect. You might not want that. You might want to just cut strips at random and cut those strips into 6.5-inch units. That's going to be fine. But I love it when I get these special centers, and this really makes the pinwheel look like it's going around the way this turned out. I am just so pleased. Okay, well, I need to stop gushing and get these sewn together. I'm going to sew this one to this one first, and then this one to this one, and then sew the center seam. Okay, here is our block all sewn together. Let's get these threads that are hanging off over there. And I am so happy with it. What do you think? Don't you just see that pinwheel turning? Look at the design in the middle. It even looks like there's a miniature pinwheel in the middle of the fabric. Oh my gosh, this is so pretty. Now, if you were with me for the introduction video to the sampler quilt, you'll know that I had planned to use some African fabrics, but I had also planned to give those African fabrics a supporting staff, meaning I wanted to put my African fabrics together in such a way each could shine and one would not be a conflict with the other. And the red corners are beautiful, but they do not detract from that pretty pinwheel in the middle. You'll also remember from the introductory video to the sampler quilt that I had said I was going to make 2 of each block. So here's the other block in the Pinwheel Polka pattern. What do you think? Made from the same pattern, different fabrics, different character, different mood. This one is far more dramatic than the other one, even though same pattern. And when you get ready to choose your fabrics, it won't matter. You're going to get what you've chosen. Once again, you can choose to fussy cut, and both of these were fussy cut. Notice that you see that little circular part of the pattern going around in the pinwheel. So there was some fussy cutting there to get that. What I didn't fussy cut is the fabric here. I could have cut it in such a way that only the little blue parts would have shown. I could have cut it so that only the red parts would have shown. But I didn't bother with that. I just cut it, made the squares, and put them on here. And I love the fact that they don't detract from the pinwheel in the middle, which is one of the reasons I think our African fabrics, which are divas, really need to be given space so that they can shine and do their thing the way they were intended to do. I hope this has been a fun block for you. I want you to try it. You might even try making a whole quilt using this block. You won't be disappointed, I can assure you of that. And remember, you're going to get some of your African fabrics out that you've been holding on to all this time because you were afraid to cut them. Don't be afraid to cut them. Look at what they can give you. Look at the beauty that's in the middle of this block. So don't deny yourself that beauty in your quilts any longer. Cut your African fabrics, use them wisely, give them a supporting cast so that they can shine. And whatever colorway you decide to use for this block, you're going to get something very different from mine, but it will be yours and just the way you want it to be. I hope you enjoy this one. I'm going to share with you the information again for cutting, and I look forward to having all of you with me when we get to block 3.